Okay, thanks everybody. So this session, the next 45 minutes, we want to just share some thoughts and some analysis that we have around publishing and publishers and IATI, but we really want to, we really welcome your thoughts about and ideas about how do we grow, how do we scale, and so to help that, we've got a couple of inputs that we thought were interesting. So next slide, please, Rob. So yes, thank you. If you can keep muted, but raise your hand if you've got a point. We're going to have plenty of time for discussion, so I think we'll keep the discussion there when we finish the slides. But also, as always, use the chat box as well. And please, yeah, if you can, activate your camera. Okay. So next slide onwards, please, Rob. Thank you. So we're going to talk about publishing and publishers, and I did a search on the IATI standard site. We say these words a lot. If you've ever been around IATI, we say publishing, publishers all the time. In fact, 301 times apparently on the IATI website. So it's a term we all say, and we're keen to understand what that means. Next slide, please, Rob. Back in 2010, I've shared this quite a few times. When I first started working with IATI, there were 5 publishers of various different sizes, as you can see, and so you could fit the publishers in a room, I guess. But if you move on, next slide, please, Rob. What we know has happened since then, we've grown and grown, and there are now 1,627 publishers apparently. So we've grown, and some reason we've seen dips and troughs and growths along the past 10 years, 10 or 12 years. Next slide, please, Rob. And it does seem, I had a look at the IATI news stories. We do, thank you, Rob. Yeah, we do seem to celebrate the milestones, 200, 500, 1,000. And then even last week, I noticed when there was the blog post about this session in Uruguay, we're talking about how many organizations are IATI, so are publishing IATI. So it's always a thing we love to do, it seems, is to count. Next slide, please, Rob. And yes, and we like to count not just the publishers, but the number of activities and the number of files, and even how big the whole of IATI is. Can we fit it on a USB stick? Seems to be a thing. So I always think about this when I think, next slide, please, Rob. I think of the very famous song from 1988, The Only Way Is Up. And it seems to be what we do in IATI. We think we must keep growing, we must keep scaling, we must keep going up and up, more publishers, more data, more activities, more transactions, all these things. So the question then I've always had, or more recently had, next slide, please, Rob, is if we keep wanting to grow, when are we finished? Do we know the end point? When is IATI done? We in UK English, we always talk about painting the fourth bridge. It's a bridge in Scotland that never-ending painting, but apparently now they've found some paint where they only have to paint it once. So my question is, for our IATI community, do we know what the finish point is, or is it just exponential? So keep that in mind as we talk about scale, please. Okay, so onwards. Next slide, please, Rob. Just keeping an eye on time. So we talked about there's 1,637 publishers. What we're interested in is who is actually publishing. As we know, we've talked over the years about dormant publishers, organizations that are not actively publishing. So we did some analysis. Next slide, please, Rob. There's a nice tool that we have that was community run and by us, and now as part of the Secretariat, we need to figure out how something like this is available through the Secretariat. So IATI Tables helps us write queries, SQL queries on the data. So we wrote a few queries to understand who is publishing. So next slide, please, Rob. This is where the interactive quiz happens. So to do this, I thought about using a Zoom poll and all those things, but we're just going to use the chat. So I would invite you to open your chat and see if you can answer these questions, and let's see who gets the nearest at least. So first slide, please, Rob. There are 1,618 publishers. So there's a difference between what I found in the screenshot, what the number is, but let's move on from that. So there are 1,618. Can anybody guess? Next slide, please, Rob. How many of those publishers published a transaction with the date in 2023? So, how many publishers? One of the 1,106. You know what I'm saying. Let's have a look. Who's saying what here? Oh, Rolf. Oh, OJ. One. So, okay, we're really coming through. Okay, it seems to be getting lower as we're going on. Right. Okay, thank you. It's a good mix of numbers there. The answer is, if someone is able to look at chat and see who got closest, they can give that person a prize. 503. I think I saw 500 somewhere. Who was that? Who was that? Volunteer now. Yeah, obviously I can't work chat and speak. So people of age stream, well done. Thank you. Yeah, so 503 publishers published a transaction in this year. So if we're thinking about publishers, that transactions are our lifeblood in IATI. And next slide, please, Rob. That's 31% of those publishers published a transaction this year. So it's not it's a third actually this year are active. Okay, fingers on buzzers again into chat. Next one. This is more numbers. There are in total, it seems, 934,083 activities. So my question to you is, thank you, Rob, how many of those activities are published by the organization type, government or multilateral publishers? How many of those? And you can use percentage if you don't want to write all the numbers, but what is the scope of activities by those types of organizations? I'm going to have a look at chat, but I'm unable to manage this thing. Coming in, 920,000, says Rolf. Okay, 30%. Bieber, 90. Okay, yeah, or 30%. Yeah, thank you. So, what is the number, please, Rob? 706,000 activities are published by the government multilateral publishers. And next slide, please, Rob. The percentage of that is 75%. So 3/4 of the activities out there are published by that set of organizations. So already we're finding that there's a smaller subset of activities that are published, that are updated, and a much larger set of organizations account for the activities. Okay, we've got a couple more. Fingers on the buzzers again. Of the 704,358 transactions that had a date in with 2023, so not the activities that had a transaction, but the specific transactions. Okay, Rob, I think everyone's going to guess what this is asking for. How many of those transactions were published by government and multilateral publishers? Again, put your numbers in the chat, or your percentage if you want. By the way, there's no prizes. I'm sorry. If someone gets the exact number, then maybe balloons will come from the ceiling. Okay, lots of numbers. I think we're on there. Rolf is very close on that one. Have I shared this with you before, Rolf? Okay, and Alex coming in good as well. What is the number, please, Rob? 613,000 transactions in 2023 were published by those government and multilateral publishers who account for a big proportion of the activities as well, and that's 87%. Thank you, Rob. So it's quite a story, I thought, of IATI. And of those, next slide, Rob, this 55% of those are actually published by UNICEF, WHO, and USAID. Now, of course, those no IATI in the room will say yes, but that's because their publication structure is X, Y, Z, and they're more voluminous in their structures. But nevertheless, I think it's still interesting to understand IATI a bit more from these perspectives. So the last question for everybody, this is perhaps less numbers in the question. Of those 1,618 publishers we talked about before, how many are government and multilateral publishers? How many of those are the ones that are accounting for all the transactions and activities? How many? And let me just check the chat once more. 150, 300, 35%, 120, 100. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So Rob, how many publishers do we know that are declaring themselves as government and multilateral publishers, that's 163. So that is, even I could work this bit out, 10%. So 10% of the publishers, moving on to the next slide, Rob, it seems like, and forgive me for my terrible assertions here, but it seems like 10% of the publishers publish 80% of their IATI right now. And has that always been the case, or is that a thing we know about? Of course, next slide, Rob. That doesn't devalue what you can call the long tail. All those publishers, all those organizations that publish one or two activities that are just as relevant, just as interesting. We had a session just before about traceability and the real need for the network of data. So I do not wish to say that the data that we haven't talked about in the quiz is not valuable. It is valuable, but it's really interesting that the big bunch of data is really clear where it comes from and who's publishing it. So that was the data analysis that we did just recently on that. And I'm going to hand over to Simon, who's been helping run the support team. Because alongside thinking what's published, we wanted to also discuss, well, how do we actually publish? How do organizations get to the point of publishing? And Simon's going to share some user journey research that we did on this. Over to you, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So, yeah, so we asked the question, how do we actually publish? If we move on, and we did some user journey analysis, and this doesn't involve any data. If we move on to the next slide, we'll see. So this involves us creating a map. So what we see here, and I'm not going to go into the detail on every single aspect of this flowchart, but this is the first stage in the route to publishing. New publishers might have a map. I'm sticking with this metaphor. And that's typically some guidance either on the IATI website or from their donor or possibly from another source. One thing that's important to recognize is that not all of these maps look the same. They don't all map the same type of journey. They won't all represent what we see here. Now, there's an important decision to be made where a publisher chooses their publishing tool. And depending on the guidance, the new publisher might not know. They have options, and indeed what the recommended one might be. And this means that by the time they get to the right-hand side where IATI support come in, they've already made some decisions that we need to take into account as we help them to publish. And as we move on to the next slide, we'll see that at this point, this is where IATI support come in, and this is where the new publisher, they reach a border really, where IATI support, unfortunately, often are the border guards. We check their documents to see if they can pass into the land of IATI. And this flowchart that we see on this slide, this is only part of the checks that we might undertake. And this is what we need to do to check a new publisher's organization identifier. So in a perfect world, a new publisher might be waved through automatically. They've correctly looked up an organization identifier and we sort of authorize it. Or they might be delayed by a matter of weeks if we need to add a new org ID record or create an XI IATI code for them. And then at this point, they continue on their journey. And if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see that the new publisher now has a verified IATI account. Great. What they haven't done is actually published any data yet. And you see there's quite a complexity. Now, we did this mapping at the start of us taking over this work so we could understand it. We could add a lot more detail to this now. We know there are more complexities to this work. So to sum this up, if we move on to the next slide, we'll see there's a snapshot of a list of queries that we get, different types, but there's a lot that come in. I haven't got the sort of data that Stephen has to back up. So I have my finger in the air that somewhere between 25% and 50% of the queries and probably the time that IATI support is spending at the moment is on the process that I've just described, is on supporting publishers to register themselves with IATI. And then in summary, the next two slides. So for some new publishers, publishing isn't straightforward. They might not have a map. They know where they want to go to, but they don't really know how to get there necessarily. We don't support them all that well. And finally, for us, publishing isn't straightforward. And this isn't a complaint. It's more a reason for us to get some cats into our presentation. And I'd also point out that it's a very good trick that Stephen's pulled there, because he's told people that we have a slide with a cat on it. We have multiple cats, so we underpromised, we over-delivered. I shall pass back over to Stephen for the provocations.
Okay, thank you, Simon. So, what we really want to go back to that question of how do we scale IATI from 1,600 publishers over 10 years, which is a pace, but not really a pace. How do we really get to the breadth and depth that I think we want? And as we can see right now, we think we've got a big, wide data set, but maybe from one point of analysis, maybe we've got a certain number of data, but not coverage everywhere to discuss. And secondly, as Simon's pointing out, the route to publishing for many organizations is quite lumpy, bumpy, confusing to even get to the point where they're contributing data into this network. So those are two things that we're discovering and finding, and I think things to discuss. I was trying to sum up what things to discuss. So next slide, please, Rob. So we know we have one standard, the IATI standard. We know we have one standard. And right now it seems like we have one size fits all. We have one standard. You must do the standard. You must do everything the same way. Now we can discuss that in a moment as well, but perhaps we want to think a little bit more. If we have one standard, next one, please, Rob. Do we need one data model? Do we need the same set of tools, the same single processes for everybody? We talked in the traceability session just before about how describing different business processes might be a much better way to add to IATI's documentation. And I think this is what we mean here is, well, rather than treating everybody with the same data model, same processes, can we have, next slide, please, Rob, plurality and diversity in our tactics and methods to grow and scale our network? Do we need to think about that as opposed to just a sheer everybody must publish the same, and there we go? So I assume this is all based on the idea. Last slide, please, Rob. We want to scale. We were prompted by Seem, who might be I hope he's in the room. Seem was asking us, he really wants to register organizations very quickly, and right now, as Simon highlighted, we have a bit of a roadblock on that. But I assume everybody, and this might be the first part of the discussion, and we want to have an open discussion here. I assume we want to scale IATI to grow, and if anyone can tell me that question of when are we finished, that would be good, and I can plan backwards. That would be really helpful. But we've got a good 20 minutes, and I'm really keen for people to add, reflect, react to some of this. And by no means was I wishing to suggest some data is more valuable than others. Thank you. That's where we are with slides. I didn't want to do too many. Who would like to start us off with this discussion? Or we go back to the cat picture. So I see this is panning out well. I see Mark is in the room. What is your reaction to this, Mark? Because I think building off the traceability session about the traceability between donors and UN agencies, for example, is the reality of the data there that we should focus in one way on that and also build the network in other ways? I'm trying to get someone to speak as well, Mark.
We've also got John Adams' hands up, so we go to Mark and then John Adams.
John, welcome.
Thanks, Stephen. And hi, everybody. I think a couple of thoughts here, Stephen. I think you're right in asking these questions, because we're ending up with what seems to be a reasonably okay quality data set from the the publishers at the center, the big donors and so on. And like you say, it tails off towards the edge. So what are the characteristics of those downstream contributors to our overall picture that we really value? Do we value just knowing that they're doing activity X in place Y, targeting sector Z? Is that good enough? Is there a good minimum data set that actually helps us to understand the network better? And secondly, where did we always talk when we looked at the interface between IATI and open contracting, for example, of where does something stop being an aid activity and start to be a contract? So how do we capture the most appropriate information about the thing that someone's doing? If they're building a thing or delivering a service, that's probably a contract. If they're managing a portfolio of activities that are directed towards beneficiaries, that's probably an aid thing. Where's the interface between those? I think those are my two thoughts. Is how do we? I like the idea of adapting it to the long tail. It means that we won't be as comprehensive in the data model, but we might get actually better value out of it. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and welcome. It's good to see you again, John. Thank you. That's really great and really helpful. I would welcome some insights from our Dutch colleagues, for example, on that, because I think if we look at other projects, other activities, other data projects that are getting mass publication, we know, for example, 360 Giving, their small organizations are pushing spreadsheets out of their transactions in our terminology, and that's really useful data, and we can use that and convert it into different formats and whatnot. And I think that it could be really interesting, but nevertheless, I think the Herman, if he's here, will be saying, but we need activities, we need all the data to connect the network. So I'm really interested in that as we adapt to the long tail and scale. What are the incentives, or sorry, what does that mean for things that are already in place at the moment?
Should we go to Mark and then Rob? Then there's a comment in the chat.
Thank you, James.
Sure, thanks a lot. I think this is a great conversation to have. I think it's very timely because there are limited resources available at a central level, and you have to, I think you can choose not to prioritize those resources and just say you kind of deal with things as they come, whatever. But that is also making a decision about, how you're prioritizing. It's basically according to, who comes or shouts loud or whatever, And I think having a more strategic focus on these kinds of things, I think is really important. I think it's inevitable, at some point, like with the growing, size of publishers and everything, at some point you have to make this decision. And I think it makes sense to do it in a thoughtful way. So I was thinking a couple of things, like one, I think it would be helpful to have stronger recommendations. Maybe they're not requirements or whatever, because people feel funny about that kind of language, but stronger recommendations, which also then feed into strategic prioritization in terms of support and tooling and all that kind of thing. In terms of, for example, very large organizations, they should go and do it themselves. They should go and publish themselves, and they should be trying to publish automatically out of their own systems. And I think having that kind of like clear approach would be, or kind of statement would be good. And maybe then in the chat, I think, so I'm trying to lower my hand. Yeah. In the chat, David mentioned also something about kind of very small organizations. How do they publish? And I think that's where there is kind of a big gap at the moment. It's quite complicated still to publish data to IATI, and making it really very simple for very, very small organizations to do that. I feel like that's something where, having some public good that does that kind of thing would be useful, but also not spending a lot of time, with each of those organizations, helping them through the steps, because that's not going to be a good use of time. I think this question about the long tail is a good one. For me, I feel like, the long tail, there's lots of, it might be quite a big chunk of organizations and data. It sounds like it, in fact, it's not really in the case of IATI, but the kind of effort involved in working with each of those organizations is large, compared to the effort of working with the larger organizations that make up the chunk. So I really feel like, having a more strategic focus, thinking about, how do you differentiate the support you provide and how you provide that to small organizations and large organizations? Where do you focus your resources and your time? I think it's really important. I think that there's a question about like, how do you differentiate the responsibility for this, I think, between the Secretariat on the one hand and others, and who are those others? So I think the Netherlands is a really good example where the Netherlands government has gone and taken that responsibility themselves to work with the long tail in the Netherlands. And I feel like that kind of approach it would be good to see if it can be emulated elsewhere. Anyway, that's what I think.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things I'm going to abuse my screen sharing privileges in a second as well. I think it's interesting you referenced OCDS, John, because one of the really cool things about OCDS and something that I learned from being involved with it a few years ago was that although you can model a very wide range of things with OCDS, the core of stuff that you actually need to publish in order to publish useful OCDS is really quite small. And if you read the IATI documentation, while that is true, you probably wouldn't know it. Like there's no sort of guided path through of this is what we really care about. This is what's important. And I think that's probably what matters. That's where who you are publishing probably matters the most. We talked about the network effect and traceability session just now. And if you're in the middle of that network, then your connections matter a lot. If you're at the closer to the ground, as it were, it probably matters less. But again, if we're making a big push for it, then we're not really we're not yet discriminating and saying this matters to you and not to you. And if this is great. One thing that really struck me when I saw this diagram, the publisher chooses an IATI tool. This point, this is one of the first things that they have to do when they start to engage with the process of making some IATI data, and it's probably before they've talked to us. That's not to say we want to handhold everyone through this process, especially not with 1,600 and more publishers. But there's very little guidance at that point to help them make that decision. And especially, again, that's another tool, another point where who you are really matters, and what you're trying to achieve really matters. And the last thing I'll say is, if we talk about IATI and open contracting, I'd be interested to know how far it matters whether it's a contract. If IATI is to model and support development cooperation, if the method by which some development happens is a contract, then does that mean it's out of scope for IATI? I don't think. When IATI's roots might be in more of an almost philanthropic model of grant making and giving money to things, if the method of delivery is now a contract, I'm not sure that inherently matters to its value to the network and to this getting this overview of where development activity is happening. But it does present challenges, of course, in what we consider value to be, what we consider to be relevant things to pull across. It'd be interesting to know how far OCDS is used in these contexts, and whether there's a nice technical solution, some cross mapping there, that's nice and easy, or whether there is some minimal part of IATI that we can point to and say, this in a contracting context, this is what we care about.
Cool, thank you. There's some good comments in the chat, but for now, can I call on Rolf?
Yeah, sure. I want to maybe continue a little bit with what Rob was saying as well. And I feel like one of the discussions that we are having a lot in IATI is it is one standard, but I feel like we could do a lot with adding a sort of profiles and say, like, what is the IATI profile for a small NGO in Somalia? And what is the IATI profile for a large donor that is also incorporated in the Aid Transparency Index? I feel like there are different benefits for the IATI community for having that data, and also different constraints of like who's going to publish that. So you could make it a lot easier by saying, like, we have a much more restricted or much more limited sort of profile for small NGOs. Whereas at the same time, I feel like there's the local stories, I know it from the Dutch context, like the local stories that they bring are what is really important to kind of get an aggregate of at the higher levels of like the big donors. And I think that in other data standards around transparency, they have these different sorts of profiles to make it easier to say, like, okay, if you're a big multi-million something, you have a different requirement of what you need to publish. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Oh, does anyone who's made a comment want to put their hand up and expand on that, or is anyone any sort of replies from your comments?
Sure. Putting my hand up doesn't seem to be working. Thank you, Firefox Zoom combination. I'll just read my comment out loud. I was just saying that we originally had commented on, we have to ask ourselves, why would a local NGO in Somalia want to publish data using IATI? And then my follow-up comment is we mostly flunked the grand bargain localization commitment from 7 years ago. And that could have been an incentive for local actors to want to make their work more visible through IATI, but we're still almost giving no direct contracts from country donors to local NGOs, and they have very limited IM resources. So no matter how easy the tools are, no matter how good the guidance is, why would they bother? It's a systemic problem, and we're trying to solve it with a technical approach. Those are my thoughts, not a question, sorry.
I think, Rolf, you have your hand up still?
Apparently, yeah, but I do want to maybe continue on David a little bit as well. Is like, I feel like right now the story for the local small NGOs is a little bit still in the framework of like reporting to bigger donors. And I felt like as soon as we get more like the original ideas of having more journalism, more transparency, local transparency and local accountability more visible, and then equipping journalists that way, that would make it more interesting for those organizations to be able to publish their information, a bit like how Twitter in the early days also really enabled small organizations to suddenly inject themselves in these kind of global discussions.
Alex.
Yeah, hi. I've made a couple of comments in the chat, but basically, John raised this question of differentiating between aid projects and contracts, and I just wanted to just maybe interrogate that a little bit further, because I'm not entirely clear about the point. One of the things that I've looked at recently is private sector aid contractors, and done some analysis on people like Adam Smith International and Chemonix in the US, and found in the case of the UK contractors that the IATI data was really useful to find information, because I mean Adam Smith International publishes pretty good comprehensive IATI data, and to kind of do a bit of an assessment of the way that aid donors are using private contractors, having that information in IATI was pretty useful. So there may be other kind of examples of service contracts, like if it's a hotel or a construction contract or something that might be of less interest, but I found the publication by private sector contractors to be useful. And the other thing that I found was that very few of the US contractors are publishing IATI data, and it would have actually been really useful to be able to see, if Chemonix was publishing comprehensive IATI data about their activities, that would be really useful to be able to see what they're doing.
Alex, if I may come in, I think, yeah, we probably need to draw a difference between, I suppose, it's disbursements and expenditure almost, because you're saying to Adam Smith, look, go and carry out a development activity, and we're going to give you money to do that. And that development activity has a bunch of metadata and characteristics of it. On the other hand, when you get further down the chain, you're going to someone and saying, build me a school. And that's a completely different beast. I think maybe it's down to that sort of differentiation.
Yeah.
If I may come in as well, a couple of things. We a very quick anecdote. We looked at some private sector data, Alex, and John reminded me that expenditures and disbursements. One of the partners to one of the donors published an activity, and there was a disbursement for £2.32 to a kebab shop. And so the immediate question is, where's the kebab shop's data? Not an, it should be an expenditure. Sorry, that's an aside. I just want to come back to, and if anyone's got any thoughts, you know, this thing about we're counting the number of published, you know, it's going up and up and up. And do we also need to, alongside revising how we talk about things, reflect on how we count things in the initiative? And maybe we need to count activities that are joined up, or other ways to count rather than just this linear path of going up. Because as I naively say, I don't know when we're finished, and it's been 10, 12 years already. So if anyone's got any ideas about how we do this, or what we count to help us have a bit more of a sophisticated way, that'd be great to hear.
I mean, my immediate response to that would be, you could count different things for different targets, right? So if you want to get completeness of the network, then the number of publishers and the number of links. If you want to get you know, an increasing coverage of the flows of the amount of aid that's being delivered, you could count financial flows and the amount of money that is being recorded. You know, if you're thinking about the amount of activity that's going on, the number of activities. So I think it may be better to just have a number of different metrics that are measuring different things that are desirable targets, and maybe setting out what those targets are and what, based on use cases, and then getting metrics for each of those targets. So identifying the use cases, identifying targets linked to those use cases, and then metrics that measure those targets would probably be the way that I'd do it.
Go ahead, Alex.
So thanks. One other kind of question that I wanted to sort of raise was maybe this question about some of the big, if we're talking about coverage of IATI, and I know that some of this stuff is quite difficult, but there are some major aid donors that aren't publishing. It may be that there's, you know, that it's been tried, and that it's been difficult to get a response from them. But maybe another way of prioritizing is to kind of see where the big gaps are in terms of volumes of aid that are being delivered by organizations that aren't publishing, and to sort of see where there are possibilities. It may be, I mean, I'm obviously thinking of like China and some of the other kind of emerging economy donors, but it may be good to do a sort of an assessment of where there is possibilities that they might be able to publish, and where there could be some kind of wins that get a lot of money into the IATI, a lot of data about large aid flows without too much effort.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, that does remind me of another thing. If we're thinking about scaling and we want to scale or complete the gaps, we should also remember that in the standard there's this thing called the secondary reporter field, and it's something we haven't I think we run away from sometimes, but it's there, and it's possible to publish the aid flows or projects or contracts for another donor without them publishing. And we don't seem to go near that conversation, and apologies for bringing that in 5 minutes before we finish. But does anyone have any thoughts about secondary publishing as a way to fill gap scale, or was this all a bad dream?
Yes, Stephen, I was just going to mention something like that, because I think some of the smaller organizations actually need they need specialists in this space to actually do the IM work for them, as David describes it. You know, we wouldn't. And I think, is there a gap in this space that, I don't know whether people like Rolf and others have explored whether there's a service opportunity for organizations that actually support organizations whose primary purpose is development or humanitarian to actually do the work that they need to do to get this into an international standard, and give them advice and support and brokerage and all those sort of things. Is there a business opportunity for people?
Yeah, I can maybe briefly address this. Like for in terms of scalability, if you need to service every organization individually, then it's not scalable in itself. Like even if all these organizations would get the funding to hire all the specialists who can help them with that, I think. So I feel like, I think OJ mentioned it in the chat as well, like it should be much more moved to the back end. Like now it's a sort of a concern that you need to know. Like if you want to publish a web page, you don't need to understand HTML. You just go to some platform or you go to your publishing system and it automatically spits out HTML without you knowing how that works. And maybe a little bit like on the secondary reporter kind of thing as well. Like that reminds me of discussions that we had earlier on with, for instance, ministries that would say like, yeah, we already gather all the data from all our recipients, so we'll just publish on their behalf. And there was a strong discussion within the IATI community, like, no, it should really be the responsibility of the organization itself. So this whole secondary reporter thing is a little bit about like, how much do you want to give them agency and responsibility? And then how much do you facilitate that, I guess?
So coming back to what OJ said, I think that was really useful. I think there is a case for almost those commoditized publication tools, and I like the idea of actually wrapping it up within platforms that people are already using. I was at NetHope in Munich a couple of weeks ago, and there's a number of organizations that actually offer things like platforms for project management platforms for organizations, NGO Online, Salesforce, Microsoft, others. What can we do as an IATI community to get IATI embedded into those platforms so that it then becomes, it is a commodity and it's something that people can just do. So maybe there's a lobbying opportunity there.
Yeah, maybe that, I'm just going to quickly respond. Maybe that ties in a little bit as well, like to the discussions that we have with Microsoft about the common data model, etc. as well. And I think maybe a research question towards the IATI Secretariat is like, what is the barriers for suppliers of these platforms currently to participate? Because obviously they're aware of it. We've also been in the past working with some of them to try to implement the IATI functionality, but somehow they don't seem to be feeling that they need to be part of the conversation here. So we're always talking about like, how do we reach them? But what's the barrier there?
Yeah, thank you, Will. Thank you, John. I think, yeah, we had a call actually with Microsoft yesterday to pick up some of this. So yeah, that common data model shouldn't be lost. But again, I appreciate your comment, Rolf, about what's the barrier. I think we really need to discover that. So